Hey guys, tonight we sink back into a time when the word sin didn't just make you feel guilty inside your own head. It could land you in front of a priest, a judge, and sometimes an entire village armed with rocks. You're about to wander the shadowy world of medieval adultery, where stepping outside your marriage wasn't just messy, it was criminal, spiritual, and often punishable in ways that you probably wouldn't survive. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know your location and the local time in the comments, because it's always fun to imagine where everyone is listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You picture yourself walking along a dirt road under a dim moon, the thatched roofs of a medieval village leaning inward like they're listening to your footsteps. Every creak of wood, every bark of a dog reminds you that in this world privacy is a fantasy. If you sneak into someone else's arms, there's always a neighbor, a cousin, or a servant ready to notice. Adultery isn't just a personal slip, it's treated like a breach in the fabric of society itself. Back then, marriage wasn't mainly about romance. It was about property, alliances, and making sure that children were undeniably legitimate heirs. If you wandered, the whole village cared, not because they were nosy, though they were definitely nosy, but because property lines, inheritances, and even the stability of the local lord's rule could depend on it. One historian actually wrote that adultery was as much about economics as it was about passion, and historians still argue whether the obsession with punishment came more from protecting property or from genuine moral outrage. So when church sermons thundered about fidelity, it wasn't just piety, it was a public safety announcement, medieval style. You'd hear preachers warning that lust opened the gates to chaos, to broken households, to the devil slinking into the community. Imagine the weight of that. Cheating wasn't just breaking a promise, it was flirting with cosmic disaster. The legal side was just as severe. Adultery appeared in law codes as both a crime against God and against the crown. It blurred boundaries. Was it blasphemy, theft, or treason? Judges often decided it was all three. This double layer, church law and secular law, meant you could be hauled before a bishop one week and flogged in the market square the next. It was a 2-for-1 deal nobody wanted. Now, if you were caught, the punishments could range from humiliating to downright fatal. And here's the kicker. People believed these punishments didn't just enforce order, they actually cleansed your soul. Imagine the logic. Sure, we're going to strip you half naked and parade you through the town, but hey, on the bright side, your soul gets a bath. Somehow, I don't think that made it easier to walk barefoot on frozen cobblestones. There's a quirky detail you might like. In some medieval towns, adulterers had to walk around carrying a huge candle to church as penance. The bigger the scandal, the bigger the candle. So if you saw your neighbor wobbling under what looked like a wax tree trunk, you knew exactly what they'd been up to last week. Candle-lit dinner dates suddenly lose their charm, don't they? Punishments weren't only about individuals, they were performances. Whole communities turned out for them because shame was a tool sharper than any sword. Being scorned by your peers might sound almost tame compared to a dungeon, but picture this. You stand in the center of the village square, and every person you've known since childhood watches, whispers, and laughs. Your reputation, your only currency in a small medieval town, melts away faster than butter near a hearth. That's why some argued that ridicule was worse than any whipping. And of course, the rules weren't equal. Men's affairs were often winked at unless they upset property lines or royal bloodlines. Women, on the other hand, bore the brunt. A wife's body was considered her husband's property and betrayal was theft. A husband's dalliances, sometimes treated as, well, a husband just being a husband. Unfair? Absolutely. Surprising for the Middle Ages? Sadly, not really. There's one fact you'll want to tuck away for later. Some medieval law codes punished adultery, not just with physical pain, but with mutilation. Cutting off noses or ears so you carried your sin literally on your face. Imagine that as a medieval version of a scarlet letter, only sharper and a whole lot bloodier. Don't worry, we'll get there in more detail, but let's just say you'd rather light the giant candle. As you drift deeper into this story, keep in mind that adultery wasn't only about two people sneaking off for forbidden affection. It was about the village watching, the church frowning, the law waiting, and sometimes an entire stage set up for your disgrace. Everyone wanted a front row seat to your downfall. Privacy may be a modern luxury, but in the Middle Ages your secrets belonged to everyone else. You breathe in that medieval night air, musty with wood smoke and damp earth, and realize stepping out of line here wasn't a private risk. It was a gamble with your life, your land, your family's survival. And as you'll soon see, the punishments could be as brutal as the betrayal itself. You might not expect this, but when people thought of punishment for adultery in the Middle Ages, the first image that often came to mind wasn't a courtroom or a priest's confessional. It was a public square and a pile of stones. The scene was almost theatrical. Villagers summoned by bells or gossip, gathering with an excitement that, disturbingly, sat halfway between religious zeal and curiosity about blood. Imagine yourself stepping into that square. The cobbles are uneven beneath your sandals. The smell of livestock lingers in the air, and at the center stands the condemned adulterer. Sometimes a woman, sometimes a man, but far more often the woman. She's forced to kneel, perhaps with her head uncovered, so the whole town can see her shame. In her mind, maybe she's wondering whether her neighbors, even her friends, will be the ones to throw the first stone. Public stoning wasn't as common in Western Europe as it was in some earlier biblical traditions, but the idea of communal judgment through stone or earth never fully disappeared. In certain Germanic regions, records suggest that adulterous women were forced into pits, then pelted with stones until they were buried. Harsh? Absolutely. But it reinforced the idea that society itself, not just the judge or the priest, delivered the punishment. Historians still argue whether these punishments were carried out as often as the laws claimed, or whether they were more of a terrifying deterrent written into codes to scare the living daylights out of potential wanderers. A mainstream historical fact here: in 13th century Saxon law, a husband could legally kill his wife and her lover if he caught them in the act. It wasn't even considered murder, it was seen as righteous justice. Imagine modern divorce courts running on that system. Awkward alimony disputes would vanish very quickly. Now for a more offbeat detail. In some places, instead of stoning, the punishment could be symbolic burial with dirt or ash. Townspeople would toss handfuls over the accused, chanting prayers as if returning the sinner's body to the ground. It was ritual theatre, half legal act, half spiritual cleansing. The accused might survive, but the message was clear: your honor has been buried. Picture the crowd's roll. Everyone was expected to participate. Even if you threw a pebble, you proved your loyalty to community morality. If you refused, whispers might start. Were you secretly defending the guilty? Or worse, were you guilty yourself? You can almost feel the pressure, like middle school peer pressure, dialed up to a life or death level. And here's where the medieval mindset cuts deepest. Punishment wasn't just about hurting the body, it was about hurting the soul through shame. Stones weren't only weapons, they were symbols of collective disapproval, tangible proof that the community itself rejected you. Of course, the punishments varied. In some French towns, instead of stones, adulterers were dragged to the gallows square and tied to posts, while bystanders hurled insults, rotten vegetables, and yes, occasionally, stones. Humiliation was the appetizer, pain was the main course. The church, for its part, sometimes tried to moderate. A priest might argue for confession, penance, and fasting instead of bloodshed. But the line was blurry, and in times of social stress, say during famine or plague, villagers were much more eager to cast stones than to cast prayers. After all, when the world feels unstable, blaming someone else feels strangely satisfying. And the imbalance between genders, painfully clear. A man accused of adultery might be fined, lectured, or at worst, whipped. A woman could find herself in a pit with stones raining down. The message was simple. Men endangered order with politics, but women endangered order with their bodies. Brutal double standard, right? One scholar notes that sometimes these punishments weren't fatal, at least not immediately. A woman could be stoned symbolically, then exiled, sent off with a ruined reputation that made survival nearly impossible. Historians still debate whether exile was a mercy or simply a slower death. And you, standing in that square, can almost hear the first stone crack against bone, the gasp of the crowd, the eerie mix of horror and fascination. The punishment was not just a sentence, it was entertainment, lesson and ritual all in one. You'd go home that night, clutching your loved one's hand a little tighter, thinking, best not to wander, best to stay in line. Remember, in the Middle Ages, it wasn't just about the act of adultery, it was about proving to everyone else that society still held together, and nothing made that clearer than a stone held in your hand, waiting for the signal to throw. Ever wondered what it would feel like to have your guilt tested, not by words or witnesses, but by fire itself? In the Middle Ages, people genuinely believed flames could expose lies, burning away dishonesty the way smoke clears a hearth. If you were accused of adultery, you might find yourself facing the dreaded ordeal by hot iron. You're standing barefoot in a cold, echoing church. The air smells of incense, but beneath that, there's the sharp metallic tang of iron glowing in a brazier near the altar. Priests chant softly, the Latin words drifting like smoke. In front of you sits a length of heated iron, sometimes a bar, sometimes a ring, sometimes even a ploughshare, depending on local custom. The challenge? Pick it up, carry it, or walk across it. Sounds easy, right? Except the iron has been heated until it glows red, like the eye of some unblinking monster. The belief was simple. God would protect the innocent. If your hand blistered badly, you were guilty. If it healed cleanly within a few days, you were absolved. It sounds wildly unfair, and honestly it was. But to medieval minds, divine justice left no room for mistakes. Historians still argue whether priests sometimes secretly intervened, cooling the iron a little for those they favoured, or delaying judgment until wounds had time to close. Was it faith, or quiet human meddling? The records don't always tell. Here's a mainstream fact. Ordeals by fire were officially banned by the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215, when the Church decided maybe, just maybe, God didn't need to be summoned through blistered hands. Still, long before that decree, countless men and women had faced the fiery test. And for adultery, an act that could tear families and property lines apart, it was one of the go-to methods of truth-finding. But let's not miss the quirky side. In some parts of Central Europe, the ordeal wasn't just about carrying iron. The accused had to walk 9 steps, holding the bar, sometimes over consecrated ground strewn with straw. If you tripped or faltered, it was considered a sign of guilt. Imagine that. Not only are your palms sizzling, but now you have to nail the medieval version of a hot coal obstacle course, while a crowd of judges, priests, and curious neighbours looks on. You probably wouldn't survive this game show audition. The ceremony often stretched over days. After gripping the iron, your hand was wrapped and sealed with wax or clay. 3 days later, the bandage would be removed in front of witnesses. If the wound looked clean, the priest declared you innocent. If it festered, well, congratulations, you just failed God's pop quiz, and the punishments that followed could be grim: public whipping, mutilation, or worse. Interestingly, there are accounts of accused nobles somehow passing their ordeals with suspicious ease. Perhaps they had access to healing ointments, or maybe the iron cooled just in time. Common villagers, meanwhile, rarely fared so well. Justice, like fire, had a habit of burning the powerless more than the powerful. Now imagine the sensory side, the heat shimmering from the brazier, the murmurs of onlookers, the weight of the glowing bar searing into your skin. The pain is instant, bright, overwhelming. You take your steps, heart pounding, trying not to scream, because even your cries might be taken as proof of guilt. And when you finally let go, your hand is a map of raw flesh and smoke. It's worth remembering that the ordeal wasn't just about proving truth, it was about spectacle. People crammed into churches to watch, convinced they were witnessing God at work. To them it wasn't cruelty. It was divine justice unfolding in real time. One chronicler even described villagers whispering afterward about the smell of burned flesh, calling it the scent of sin departing. That's one way to ruin your appetite before dinner. The ordeal by fire carried deep symbolism. Fire was purifying, cleansing, transformative. Holding that iron was like holding your soul up to inspection. If you were innocent, you'd emerge unscathed, like gold refined in the furnace. If guilty, you'd carry scars that marked you for life. Either way, the community believed justice had been served. And so, as you picture yourself standing in that dim medieval church, palms wrapped and throbbing, you realize the stakes weren't just physical, they were cosmic. In that moment, your pain was proof that heaven and earth had joined forces to decide your fate. And as your neighbors watched, nodding solemnly, you couldn't help but think, maybe exile would have been easier than fire. You might not expect this, but sometimes the test for adultery didn't involve heat at all. It involved the opposite. Instead of fire, it was water that became the judge, a cold and unforgiving element that carried its own kind of terror. Picture it, a village gathered by the edge of a river, the air damp and heavy, the sky brooding with grey clouds. At the centre of the crowd stands the accused, perhaps trembling, perhaps defiant, about to undergo what was called the ordeal of cold water. The logic was bizarre but compelling to medieval minds. Water, seen as pure and holy, would reject the guilty and accept the innocent. If you floated, the water was spitting you out. If you sank, you were innocent. Comforting, right? Except for the small detail that sinking often meant drowning before anyone got around to pulling you back up. This ordeal wasn't unique to adultery. It was also famously used in witch trials centuries later. But when applied to marital betrayal, it carried the same haunting symbolism. Imagine being accused of infidelity and finding yourself bound with ropes, lowered into a pond, your neighbors leaning over the edges to see whether you bobbed like an apple or slipped beneath the surface like a stone. A mainstream fact. One version of this trial was described in 9th and 10th century legal texts in parts of Germany and France, where judges ordered suspected adulterers tied and tossed into rivers. Survival itself became the proof of guilt or innocence. Historians still argue whether this was actually done often, or whether the mere threat of it was enough to coerce confessions. After all, who wouldn't confess when faced with the prospect of drowning in front of an entire village? And here's the quirky tidbit. Some towns believed the water would literally spit the guilty out by making them float awkwardly on their backs like an inflatable mattress someone forgot to deflate. People even noted whether bubbles rose to the surface, interpreting them as the water rejecting sin. You can imagine villagers squinting at the ripples, whispering, "See, even the pond doesn't want her." The sensory experience would have been brutal. The water, icy even in summer, clutched your body like 1,000 needles. Your lungs burned as you held your breath, struggling not to thrash, because panic could be read as guilt. Meanwhile, children pointed, neighbors gasped, and priests muttered prayers on the banks. You, the accused, became a living sermon. Of course, just like with fire, loopholes existed. Nobles and the wealthy often avoided water trials altogether, paying fines or arranging private penance with the church instead. Commoners, though, weren't so lucky. And while the test was supposedly about divine justice, people often quietly agreed to pull someone up early if they sank too quickly. Not out of mercy necessarily, but because dead sinners couldn't pay fines or perform penance. There's also an open scholarly debate about whether these ordeals were really believed to show truth, or whether they functioned more as rituals of social control. Maybe villagers didn't care about innocence at all, they just wanted a spectacle, a communal drama that reinforced moral boundaries. Either way, floating or sinking, you rarely emerged with your reputation intact. The most chilling part? If you floated, you were guilty. If you sank, you were innocent, but also gasping for life as men scrambled to haul you back. Survival meant shame. Near death meant vindication. Either way, you stumbled back onto land, shivering, coughing, and branded forever in the minds of your community. You can almost feel it now, the chill of the water wrapping your body, the roar of villagers' voices echoing above, the uncertainty of whether hands would pull you out in time. Between fire that burned your skin and water that drowned your breath, medieval justice didn't give you many cozy options. You might not expect this, but sometimes the harshest punishment for adultery didn't draw blood at all. It stripped away pride, beauty, and dignity in ways that lingered long after the act itself was forgotten. In the Middle Ages, public humiliation wasn't just a tool, it was a weapon sharper than steel, and one of the most common methods was disfigurement, shaved heads, branded flesh, and visible scars that turned your private betrayal into a lifelong billboard. Imagine waking up in your small timber-framed house, accused and condemned. Instead of being led to a pit of stones or a riverbank, you're dragged to the center of the market square. A crowd gathers, children tugging at their mothers' skirts, old men leaning on staffs, merchants pausing their bargaining. At the front stands the local executioner, or beadle, holding not a sword, but shears. Shaving a woman's head was the medieval equivalent of destroying her identity. Hair symbolized honor, fertility, even divine favor. To lose it was to be marked as dishonored, no matter how finely you dressed afterward. You'd walk home with your scalp stubbled and raw, neighbors snickering, whispers following you into church pews for months. Historians still argue whether this practice came more from biblical symbolism, shorn hair as a sign of sin, or from simple cruelty designed to make women unattractive to future suitors. Men weren't immune, but their punishments tended to lean toward branding. Heated irons pressed into shoulders, hands, or sometimes foreheads left permanent reminders of guilt. A scar, shaped like a letter, a mark burned deep into flesh, was impossible to hide. Imagine holding out your hand to buy bread at the market, and every vendor recognizing instantly what you had done years ago. No need for gossip, your skin told the tale. A mainstream fact in parts of 12th and 13th century France, records note adulterous women being paraded with their head shaved and sometimes whipped while wearing only a chemise. The humiliation was worse than the pain. Your body became a living warning sign to others. Stray, and you'll end up like her. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, shaving wasn't done with shears alone. Accused women had their hair hacked off with knives, uneven and jagged, leaving them looking wild and grotesque. The crowd laughed louder at the sight, proving that humor and cruelty have always made unsettling companions. And then there was mutilation, the most terrifying variation. Certain legal codes, like those in medieval Germany, allowed for the cutting off of noses, ears, or even lips. The idea was that beauty had been misused for sin, so beauty itself should be destroyed. Harsh logic, but it stuck. A woman missing her nose wasn't just disfigured, she was socially exiled. Marriage, survival, and dignity became nearly impossible afterward. It's hard not to picture yourself in that square, sitting on a stool while rough hands shear away your hair. You can feel the clumps falling against your neck, the cold air biting your bare scalp, the jeers of neighbors who used to smile politely when you passed. Maybe someone throws a rotten egg, maybe someone spits. You can't fight back. The punishment isn't about pain. It's about erasing the person you once were. Men, too, sometimes lost ears or carried brands. But here's the twist. Nobles were usually spared such disfigurements. They paid fines, confessed in chapels, or arranged marriages to patch up scandal. The marks of shame were reserved for commoners whose bodies served as public examples. Justice wasn't blind. It was obsessed with hierarchy. And the debate among scholars continues. Was this about morality or about control? Did communities truly believe shaving and branding purified the soul, or did they simply enjoy the spectacle of tearing someone down? Either way, the effect was the same. Once marked, you carried your punishment into every interaction, every glance, every whispered laugh that followed you down the street. So, as you picture yourself walking home, scalp bare and stinging, or skin seared with an iron's imprint, you realize this punishment wasn't meant to kill you. It was meant to make you live every single day as a reminder of your sin. And in many ways, that was the cruelest sentence of all. Ever wondered why being laughed at can sting more than being hit? In the Middle Ages, communities seemed to understand this instinctively, which is why adulterers often found themselves locked in pillories or stocks, wooden frames designed less to break your bones than to break your pride. You picture yourself trudging into the market square, escorted not by soldiers with drawn swords, but by a few smug townsfolk who know everyone else is already waiting. At the centre of the square stands a heavy block of wood, carved with holes for your neck and wrists. The air smells of bread and manure. The chatter of vendors mixes with the shuffle of hooves. You can already hear the crowd gathering, not to mourn you, not to pity you, but to enjoy the spectacle. The pillory wasn't invented just for adultery. It punished thieves, liars, and cheats too. But when used for marital betrayal, it carried a particular sting. Fidelity was sacred, and to betray it was to betray the whole village's fragile balance. So locking you up in public became a ritual of ridicule. People didn't need to throw stones. They threw laughter, rotten food, and insults sharp enough to leave scars. Here's a mainstream fact. Across medieval England and France, the pillory was one of the most common punishments for adultery. It was portable enough to be wheeled into busy markets, and sentences often coincided with holy days, guaranteeing a maximum audience. Think of it as the medieval version of being cancelled, except instead of trending hashtags, you got turnips hurled at your head. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some towns, the adulterer had to hold a symbolic object during their time in the stocks, like a loaf of bread, a candle, or even a pair of horns, mocking the cuckold husband. Imagine being trapped in wooden beams while someone sticks goat horns on your head, children giggling as they dance around you. It's like a Renaissance fair gone very, very wrong. The punishment lasted hours, sometimes days. Your neck stiffened, your wrists ached, and you couldn't swat away the flies or the children smearing mud on your cheeks. The real pain came not from bruises, but from exposure. Everyone saw you, neighbours, relatives, business partners. Tomorrow, when you tried to buy flour or hire a farmhand, they'd remember you as the one in the stocks. In a world where reputation was survival, that kind of branding cut deeper than any blade. Historians still argue whether these punishments worked as deterrents, or whether they simply entertained a bored population. After all, in a time with no theatre tickets or TikTok feeds, watching your neighbour locked in a pillory while chickens strutted past was free entertainment. It reinforced morality, yes, but it also broke up the monotony of village life. You can almost feel the rough grain of the wood against your skin, smell the onion someone just hurled, hear the jeers echoing off the timbered houses. For some, the shame was unbearable. There are tales of people fainting in the pillory or emerging so disgraced they left the village forever. Survival wasn't just about enduring the punishment, it was about enduring the glances afterward, day after day. Men and women both faced the stocks, but again, the weight fell heavier on women. A husband's dalliance might be mocked. A wife's was treated as a scandal demanding full humiliation. Double standards baked into oak beams, and yet there was a strange kind of ritual order to it. The pillory was placed where everyone could see, where the community could collectively cleanse itself by ridiculing you. It was law and theatre blended into one, a morality play, with you, unwillingly, cast as the fool. So as the sun sets and the crowd finally disperses, you remain locked, flies buzzing around, dignity long gone. Your body isn't broken, but your pride shattered. And in medieval logic, that was exactly the point. You might not expect this, but some punishments for adultery were designed to be mobile, parading you through the very streets you used to walk freely, except now every step came with a sting. Whipping in public wasn't just about pain, it was about turning your body into a moving spectacle, a walking sermon for everyone who saw you pass. Picture yourself at dawn, the church bells tolling, not for mass but for judgment. You're hauled from your cell, wrists bound, shoulders bare. A rope ties you to the beadle or the town guard, who carries a whip braided from leather and sometimes tipped with knots or bits of metal. Behind you trails a small crowd, neighbours, merchants, maybe even your children, waiting to see the justice of the day unfold. The punishment begins at the market square. A proclamation is read aloud: found guilty of adultery, condemned to be flogged through the streets. Then the whip cracks. The sound is sharp, slicing the morning air like a breaking branch. Each strike makes you flinch, but the real cruelty is knowing there are eyes at every window, hands pointing from every doorway. Here's a mainstream fact. Whipping for adultery was recorded across much of Europe, especially in the 12th to 15th centuries. In France and parts of Italy, guilty women were sometimes whipped bare to the waist, marched around town, then forced to kneel at church doors to beg forgiveness. Men, if whipped, often endured fewer lashes and their processions were shorter. Historians still argue whether the imbalance came from genuine belief in women's greater tempting power or from patriarchal convenience. Now for a quirky tidbit. In some towns, adulterers were whipped, not only through the streets but also around the churchyard, circling it 3 times like a grim parody of a holy procession. Villagers lined up as though watching a festival, except instead of flowers and banners, there were lashes and blood. Imagine trying to keep your dignity while staggering past the same bakery where you once bought bread. The whip wasn't always lethal, but it left marks: swollen welts, cuts that stung with sweat and dirt, bruises that lingered for weeks. The physical pain eventually healed, the memory of being dragged through the streets while children laughed and elders scowled. That never really faded. In fact, the pain was designed to be temporary, so the shame could last longer. You can almost hear the rhythm of it now, the jangle of the guard's keys, the shuffle of your bare feet on the stone, the crack of leather echoing between timbered walls. The crowd murmurs, then gasps, then laughs. For some, the punishment becomes gossip fodder. For others, a grim reminder to stay faithful. Interestingly, the wealthy often managed to commute their whippings into fines. They paid the town coffers, skipped the lashes, and walked away with their dignity intact. The poor, meanwhile, felt the whip. Justice, once again, was as uneven as the cobblestones under your bleeding feet. And here's where scholars disagree. Was public flogging intended more to deter future sins, or was it simply a form of sanctioned entertainment? Some accounts describe villagers turning punishments into festivals, complete with vendors selling snacks while watching their neighbours whipped. Nothing like a bag of roasted chestnuts to go with your dose of morality theatre. By the time the guard finally unbound you, your back ached, your head spun, and your reputation lay in tatters along with your skin. You weren't just punished, you were paraded, displayed, dissected by every pair of eyes. Tomorrow, when you tried to live normally, the whispers would begin again. And in a world where whispers could be deadlier than swords, the lash across your back might not have been the worst part. Ever wondered what it would feel like to have your punishment last not minutes, not hours, but months or even years? In some cases, instead of whipping or branding, adulterers were sentenced to exile or, more specifically, to long pilgrimages. On paper, it sounded spiritual: walk to a holy site, pray for forgiveness, cleanse your soul. In reality, it was punishment disguised as piety, a journey that could strip you of home, comfort, and sometimes even life itself. You picture yourself standing before the church door at dawn, a sack thrust into your arms, a staff pressed into your hand. Your shoes are thin, your clothes marked to show you've been condemned. A priest announces that you will walk to a shrine hundreds of miles away, perhaps Canterbury, perhaps Santiago de Compostela, perhaps even Rome. Everyone in the village knows you are leaving not by choice, but because your sin demands it. A mainstream fact by the 12th century, forced pilgrimages were a common penalty in parts of England, France, and the Germanic states. Courts ordered the guilty to travel barefoot, sometimes in chains, and to beg for food along the way. The hardship wasn't only physical, it was meant to humble your pride, to reduce you from a member of the community to a wandering outcast. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some towns required adulterers to carry symbolic objects on their pilgrimages, like a wooden cross, or even the severed hide of an animal slung across their back to mark them as sinful. Imagine trudging through villages with a cowhide rotting on your shoulders, people wrinkling their noses as you passed. You were literally branded as unclean. The sensory reality was harsh. Roads were muddy, filled with thieves and beggars. You slept in barns, prayed in strange chapels, begged bread from strangers who might spit instead of share. The ache in your feet turned every step into penance, every mile into another lash of shame. You might whisper prayers at shrines, but the louder voice in your head was always, "Will I ever be allowed home again?" Historians still argue whether forced pilgrimages were truly spiritual punishments or just a convenient way to rid communities of troublemakers. Sending someone on the road solved two problems at once. It punished the sinner, and it got them out of everyone else's sight. Was it redemption or exile with extra steps? The debate lingers. Interestingly, the wealthy once again found loopholes. Some hired substitutes, yes, stand-ins who would walk the pilgrimage in their name. You can imagine a poor man trudging across Europe, muttering, "I don't even know who she cheated with, but here I am in Rome anyway." For nobles, sin became negotiable. For peasants, sin became blisters and hunger. And think about the irony. Pilgrimages were supposed to bring people closer to God, but forced ones probably made the guilty feel more bitterness than holiness. The shrines they reached weren't always seen as miracles, but as the finish line in a marathon they never signed up for. By the time you staggered back to your home village, if you were even allowed to return, you looked nothing like the person who left. Thin, scarred, eyes hollow, from months on the road. Some never came back at all, dying in foreign towns where no one knew their names. So as you imagine your own feet sinking into the muck of a rain-soaked road, shoulders sore from a sack you can't put down, you realize exile wasn't always about distance. Sometimes the real punishment was knowing you no longer belonged anywhere. Not in your home, not in the villages you passed, not even in the shrines where you prayed. You were a pilgrim, yes, but also a ghost, wandering the edges of forgiveness. You might not expect this, but adultery wasn't limited to peasants sneaking behind barns or nobles whispering in gardens. The clergy themselves, those sworn to celibacy, discipline and piety, sometimes found themselves caught in forbidden liaisons. And when that happened, the punishments weren't just harsh, they were cloaked in an extra layer of shame, because betrayal of vows was seen as doubly sinful. Imagine yourself in a monastery built of stone, its cold walls echoing with chants. Life here is supposed to be orderly, hours marked by bells, days filled with prayer, study and silence. But even in cloisters, desire whispered. Priests, monks and nuns occasionally strayed, and when they did, they weren't judged in open squares like peasants. Their punishment took place behind closed doors in what were essentially monastic prisons. A mainstream fact, records from 12th and 13th century church courts describe monks and priests caught in affairs being confined to small cells, sometimes for months or years. Meals were meagre, contact was minimal, and the goal wasn't just to discipline but to break the will. You weren't whipped in front of villagers. You were left in darkness, punished by silence itself. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some monasteries forced guilty monks to wear chains at all times, even during prayer. Imagine kneeling in chapel, the clank of iron around your ankles, loud enough for everyone else to hear. Your sin announced itself with every step. For nuns, penance might involve bread and water diets for years, or isolation so strict that some historians liken it to slow social death. The sensory side is chilling. Picture a narrow cell, damp straw on the floor, one slit of a window barely admitting light. The air smells of mildew and wax, the silence broken only by distant chanting. Your stomach gnaws at itself from hunger, your mind circles endlessly around regret, shame, or perhaps bitter defiance. No jeering crowd here, just the echo of your own thoughts as punishment. Historians still argue whether these sentences were meant to rehabilitate or to erase. Some argue the goal was to bring monks and nuns back into the fold of discipline, while others suggest it was simply about making examples to deter others. Either way, the result was the same. Years stolen, identities ground down in cold stone chambers. Interestingly, clerical hypocrisy wasn't exactly rare. Priests who thundered sermons about adultery sometimes kept mistresses or fathered children of their own. When caught, they faced disgrace, but many managed to dodge the worst punishments by leaning on influence or bribery. A poor monk, however, had no such shield. The iron chains clanked loudest for the powerless. Imagine being the one dragged from a convent garden, accused of breaking vows, then locked away in silence. No family visits, no friendly chatter at meals, just endless hours with only your shame and a crucifix on the wall. It's a punishment more terrifying in its quietness than in any lash of a whip. And here's something eerie. Some punished monks wrote confessions or laments scratched into the wood of their cells, small graffiti that sometimes survives today. Their words blur the line between repentance and despair. You can almost hear them, centuries later, whispering from the cracks, "I sinned, I was punished, I was forgotten." So while peasants bore scars in the marketplace, the clergy bore scars in silence. The end result was the same, lives shattered, dignity stripped, but the stage was different. For the commoner, punishment was theatre. For the priest, or nun, punishment was a dungeon of the soul. You might not expect this, but some punishments for adultery weren't about chains, cells, or blood at all. They were about shutting you up quite literally. Enter the scold's bridle, a cruel contraption of iron designed to silence women accused not only of infidelity, but of gossip, nagging, or simply being too outspoken. And when applied to adultery, it carried an especially sharp edge. The message wasn't just, "you sinned," it was, "you have no voice." Picture the device itself. A heavy iron frame, shaped to fit over the head like a cage, straps locked around the back of the skull, and worst of all, an iron bit, a flat plate or spiked tongue, forced into the mouth, pressing down on the tongue so you couldn't speak, couldn't shout, couldn't even swallow without discomfort. Breathing was possible, but talking was impossible. You became a silent effigy, a walking symbol of disgrace. A mainstream fact, while scold's bridles are more famously associated with early modern England and Scotland, especially in the 16th century, some scholars argue their prototypes existed in the late medieval period as punishments for women caught in moral or marital offences. The earliest surviving records describe them being used in cases of slander and suspected adultery, because a woman's words, once deemed untrustworthy, were treated as dangerous weapons. And here's the quirky tidbit: some bridles had bells attached. That meant as you were paraded through town, every jingle announced your presence, like a shameful parade float. Children laughed, neighbours pointed, and you couldn't even defend yourself with words. Imagine the absurd cruelty. Your disgrace literally rang out as you shuffled past. The sensory reality was unbearable. The iron bit scraped against your tongue, metal clanging against teeth with every step. Drool pooled and spilled down your chin, making you look even more grotesque. The weight of the cage pressed into your scalp, leaving bruises. And the humiliation of silence, knowing you couldn't even beg for mercy, cut deeper than the iron itself. Historians still argue whether this punishment was widely used in the Middle Ages or more symbolic, a threat that loomed larger than its actual practice. Was it common in villages or reserved for the most notorious cases? The debate remains unresolved, but even if rare, the image of it, iron wrapped around the head, voice stolen, was powerful enough to terrify. And of course the gender divide was blatant. Men almost never wore bridles. They might be whipped, fined, or paraded, but rarely silenced. Women, however, were judged not only for their actions, but for their words, their tone, their gossip. To accuse a wife of adultery and then cage her tongue was to doubly erase her place in society. Now imagine the procession. You're led through muddy streets, the cage rattling with every step, bells jingling, neighbours craning to see. Some laugh, some cross themselves, some shake their heads with pity or with smug satisfaction that it's you and not them. You can't speak, you can't defend yourself. All you can do is stumble forward, cheeks burning, drool dripping, every jingle of the bell sealing your humiliation. It wasn't about justice, it was about control. The scold's bridle didn't just punish adultery, it reinforced who was allowed to speak and who wasn't. It told the whole village, loudly and cruelly, that women who strayed, or even seemed like they might, had better learn silence. So as the iron cage presses down and the laughter of the crowd fills your ears, you realize the cruel genius of the device. It didn't have to draw blood, it only had to steal your voice. And in a world where speaking was survival, that silence was its own kind of death. You might not expect this, but even the supposedly pure and cloistered world of convents wasn't free from suspicion of adultery or illicit affection. Behind those high stone walls, where silence and prayer were supposed to rule every hour, rumors could spread like smoke through rafters. And when a nun was accused of stepping outside her vows, the punishments were severe, not only because of the betrayal itself, but because the entire convent's reputation was thought to hang in the balance. Picture the convent, a stone courtyard lined with arches, herbs drying in windows, the sound of chanting drifting down a chilly corridor. Nuns moved through their routines like clockwork, gardening, copying manuscripts, caring for the sick. To the outside world, it was a place of purity, a fortress against worldly temptation. But human nature didn't stop at the convent gate. Bonds could form, sometimes with priests, sometimes with other nuns, sometimes with men who lingered near the walls. And when those bonds crossed into scandal, the punishment was as much about protecting the institution as punishing the woman. A mainstream fact, church records from the 13th and 14th centuries include cases of nuns accused of adultery or illicit love affairs. The punishments varied. Some were confined to their cells for months or years, some placed on harsh bread and water diets, and some even expelled from the convent entirely. Expulsion was devastating. Without the convent's protection, many had nowhere to go, their families unwilling or unable to take them back. Here's a quirky tidbit. In a few convents, suspected nuns were forced to wear special garments marking them as sinners. Rough, scratchy wool, dyed a dull color, so every sister knew, at a glance, who had broken vows. Imagine standing in the choir for prayers, your coarse robe itching, the eyes of your sisters flicking toward you with every chant. The shame was constant, woven literally into your clothing. The sensory experience was suffocating. Picture a dim stone cell, the air damp, the only light a candle stub. You're locked in for weeks, eating nothing but stale bread, drinking lukewarm water, hearing mass through the door, but never joining the others. Outside, life continues, bells ring, voices murmur, but you're cut off, your sin echoing louder in isolation. Historians still argue whether these punishments were more about protecting spiritual integrity or simply about control. Was the church truly worried about the nun's soul, or more concerned about gossip reaching nearby villages? After all, one scandal could tarnish an entire convent's reputation, making it harder to attract novices or donations. In a sense, each nun's body became property of the convent, and a single betrayal threatened the whole enterprise. It's worth noting, too, that suspicion didn't always equal guilt. A nun who seemed too friendly, too joyful, or simply too different could find herself accused. And once the whispers started, defense was nearly impossible. Silence was expected, so even protest could be read as proof. Imagine kneeling in the chapel after weeks of punishment, your body weak from hunger, your voice hoarse from chanting alone in your cell. You glance at the other nuns, their faces calm, their hands folded, and wonder how many of them have their own secrets hidden behind lowered eyes. The punishment may have been yours, but the fear belonged to everyone. In the end, convent walls kept temptation out only in theory. Inside, humanity lingered, desire, weakness, affection. And when punishment came, it was swift, silent, and suffocating, meant to make the sinner invisible until she either repented or disappeared entirely. You might not expect this, but sometimes adultery wasn't punished with chains or whips. It was punished with ritual. Instead of bleeding or bruises, you were made to stand in front of your neighbors, stripped of dignity, forced to confess in a way that seared deeper than physical pain. These public confessions often took place at church doors where everyone gathered not only to worship, but to watch you grovel. Imagine it, the morning air crisp, the bell tolling for Mass. Villagers shuffled toward the church in their best wool cloaks, clutching rosaries or prayer beads. And there you are, barefoot, head bowed, sometimes stripped down to a simple chemise, waiting at the great wooden doors. The stone beneath your feet is cold, rough, already biting your skin. A priest stands beside you, reading out your offense in a solemn, ringing voice. Adultery. Your name, your shame, echoing across the square. A mainstream fact in parts of 12th and 13th century Europe, especially France and England. Adulterers were required to perform public penance at church doors. They often stood barefoot through the service, then knelt to beg forgiveness as each parishioner filed past. It was a punishment rooted in the belief that sin wasn't just private. It infected the whole community, and so the whole community had to see it cleansed. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some confessions required the guilty to hold candles taller than themselves, struggling to keep the flame steady while villagers smirked. The bigger the scandal, the bigger the candle, like a bizarre medieval metric system for shame. If you dropped the candle or let the flame go out, whispers flew that even God rejected your repentance. The sensory details are striking. You feel every eye on you as parishioners pass, some glaring, some smirking, some whispering behind their hands. The smell of incense drifts out from the church doors, mixing with the earthy scent of mud clinging to your bare feet. The wind lifts your thin garment, and you shiver, not just from cold, but from exposure. You try to focus on prayers, but the murmurs of your neighbors drown them out. Historians still argue whether this practice was more about true repentance or about public theatre. Was the goal really to cleanse your soul, or to entertain villagers while reinforcing moral order? Some chroniclers hint that people treated confession days as half-solemn, half-spectacle events, whispering about who would be kneeling at the door this week. And the gender divide struck again. Women accused of adultery were paraded more often, made to endure harsher humiliation, while men sometimes confessed privately, behind cloister doors, with only a token candle as punishment. A woman's body was seen as a vessel of sin, and so her shame had to be displayed like a warning sign. Now imagine kneeling as Mass ends. Parishioners file past, each one forced to look at you. Some shake their heads piously, some avoid your eyes, others let their gazes linger, enjoying your disgrace a little too much. You whisper apologies, voice cracking, lips trembling. Whether you mean them or not doesn't matter. What matters is that you've been seen, humiliated, branded in memory. By the time the priest finally dismisses you, your knees ache, your hands are numb from holding the heavy candle, and your dignity lies scattered like ash on the church steps. You're allowed back inside the community, but not fully. Forgiveness was never entirely clean. So, in a way, these ritual confessions were worse than whippings. A scar might fade, but the memory of kneeling barefoot before your entire village, that humiliation lived on, etched deeper than any iron brand. You might not expect this, but adultery could cost you more than your pride, more than your skin, more than your voice. It could cost you everything you owned. In the Middle Ages, punishment often had a financial twist. Dowries confiscated, inheritances stripped, property seized. It wasn't just your body on trial, it was your wealth, your family's security, and sometimes your children's futures. Imagine being a married woman in a small town. Your dowry, the bundle of land, coin, or livestock your family gave to your husband when you wed, is the foundation of your household. It's what ensures you'll be cared for, what ties your family to his, what secures your children's inheritance. Now picture standing accused of adultery and hearing the sentence, "Your dowry is forfeit." Just like that, the marriage bargain collapses. Your family loses their investment, your husband gains legal excuse to cast you out, and your children are left with nothing. A mainstream fact across much of medieval Europe, especially under canon law and in French customary law. An adulterous wife often lost her dowry entirely. Her husband could reclaim it, or the church might seize it for pious uses. Legal texts spelled it out plainly. Infidelity voided the financial bonds of marriage. Historians still argue whether these confiscations were meant as punishment for sin or simply a convenient way to enrich husbands and the church alike. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some towns, seized dowries were paraded as trophies. A cart might carry away a woman's chest of linens or her livestock while neighbours watched, a spectacle of wealth stripped bare. Imagine seeing your wedding gifts, candlesticks, blankets, even chickens, hauled through the streets, not to bless your household, but to mark your disgrace. The sensory side of this punishment was quieter than a whip, but far more devastating. You return to a house with empty shelves, your children asking why their beds are bare, why their clothes are gone. The cold draught through the rooms is matched only by the coldness of your husband's silence. You've been punished not just in your body, but in your home itself. Men accused of adultery, of course, often faced no such loss. Their estates remained intact, their dowries untouched. A husband's straying was dismissed as weakness. A wife's straying was treated as theft, stealing not only his honor, but his wealth. It's no wonder many women accused of adultery begged for lesser punishments, preferring even flogging over financial ruin. The imbalance wasn't just about gender, it was about class too. Noblewomen could sometimes negotiate, calling on family influence to preserve parts of their dowry. Peasant women, lacking leverage, lost everything. Their punishment echoed for generations, condemning children to poverty long after the original sin was forgotten. Imagine yourself standing in a courtroom lit by flickering candles, hearing the verdict read, "She shall forfeit her dowry." You watch as clerks scribble records, as guards head toward your home to seize goods. You think of the quilt your mother stitched, the silver cup gifted by your uncle, the cow tethered in your yard. Soon, all gone, and worse, everyone will know it. Historians still debate whether confiscating dowries truly protected the moral order, or whether it simply reminded women that their bodies were tied directly to property. In medieval logic, fidelity wasn't just a promise, it was collateral. So as you imagine those carts rolling away, wheels creaking under the weight of your lost belongings, you realize adultery didn't just scar skin or silence tongues, it dismantled lives brick by brick, until even the walls of your home testified against you. You might not expect this, but some punishments for adultery left marks that never healed. Not emotional scars, but physical ones carved directly onto the body. Medieval justice often believed that if someone's sin came through their flesh, then their flesh should bear the punishment forever. That logic gave rise to laws of mutilation, ears, noses, and even lips cut away as living symbols of shame. Picture yourself in a dim, stone hall, the air heavy with smoke from torches. The local judge, flanked by clerks, declares that you are guilty of adultery. Instead of ordering your death, he orders something in some ways worse, mutilation. The guards seize you, drag you forward, and before the crowd, you hear the chilling scrape of a knife being drawn. This punishment doesn't kill you, but it ensures no one who sees you will ever forget. A mainstream fact. Under medieval Germanic law codes, including parts of the Saxon Spiegel in the 13th century, mutilation was a legal punishment for adultery. A woman might lose her nose, ears, or part of her lip. The rationale was simple. Beauty had been used to tempt, so beauty itself must be destroyed. Historians still argue whether these sentences were frequently carried out, or whether their mere threat was enough to terrify women into obedience. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some towns believed cutting off the nose specifically erased a woman's attractiveness, so nose cutting became shorthand for adultery in local jokes and ballads. Imagine walking through a marketplace, hearing children sing rhymes about women with no noses, grim humor at the expense of the punished. The sensory experience would have been horrific. You can almost feel the cold grip of iron shackles, the torchlight glinting on the blade, the crowd leaning forward. Pain explodes as the knife slices sharp, sudden, blinding. Blood runs warm across your skin, gasps rise from the onlookers, and your scream echoes off the stone walls. And then it's done. You're still alive, but disfigured forever. Every mirror, every glance from a neighbor, every child's gasp on the street reminds you of what was taken. Men weren't always spared, though their punishments were rarer. Some law codes demanded castration for adulterous husbands, especially if they dishonored noble households. But in practice, women bore the brunt because their fidelity mattered more to inheritance, lineage, and property rights. A man's dalliance might be overlooked. A woman's became a knife to her own face. Imagine stepping out into daylight afterward, a cloth pressed to your wound, the crowd staring, some pitying, some smug. You pass by your old friends and they avert their eyes. You pass by children and they point and whisper. You are no longer just yourself. You are the one who lost her nose. A living warning sign. Historians still debate whether this practice was about morality or about power. Was mutilation meant to purge sin or simply to control women by destroying their ability to attract future partners? The answer, perhaps, lies in both. Either way, the punishment was effective. Few ever risked repeating it. And so you can almost feel it, centuries later. The phantom pain of mutilation, the cruel permanence of a knife's judgment. In a world where your face was your dignity, your beauty, even your currency, losing it wasn't just punishment, it was erasure. You might not expect this, but sometimes medieval punishments for adultery went far beyond humiliation, branding, or mutilation. They descended into the unthinkable. In rare but chilling cases, women accused of infidelity were sentenced to be buried alive. It wasn't the most common punishment, but the very fact that it existed tells you how terrifyingly creative medieval justice could be. Picture the scene. A wooden coffin-sized pit dug into the earth, the smell of soil heavy in the air, the crowd gathered in stunned silence. The accused woman, hands bound, is forced to step down into the hole. Maybe she cries out, maybe she prays, maybe she stays eerily quiet, because what words could change anything now? The executioners begin to shovel dirt back in, slowly at first, then faster. Each clump thuds against her body, each breath grows shorter. This isn't just punishment, it's ritual erasure, returning the sinful body to the ground as if it never should have existed. A mainstream fact, medieval legal codes in parts of the Holy Roman Empire, particularly in German territories during the 12th and 13th centuries, listed burial alive as an official penalty for female adultery. Sometimes it was reserved for wives of common soldiers or peasants, where dishonor was thought to endanger the fragile bonds of the household. Historians still argue whether the punishment was frequently carried out or whether it served mainly as a symbolic terror written into the law. And here's a quirky tidbit. In some regions, burial alive wasn't done in silence. The accused might be placed in a sack or cask with a live animal, sometimes a dog, sometimes a rooster, and lowered together into the ground. The idea was that both sinner and beast would die together, sealing the punishment with a grotesque kind of companionship. You can almost hear the confused squawk of a rooster in the darkness, the last sound before earth closed overhead. The sensory side is suffocating to imagine. You feel the cold dirt pressing against your legs, your chest tightening as the hole fills, the muffled jeers or prayers of the crowd above. The air grows thinner, the world darker. Panic claws at you, but your arms are bound. The moment is stretched unbearably long, a slow-motion death more terrifying than any swift execution. This punishment was reserved almost exclusively for women. Men were rarely, if ever, buried alive for adultery. They might be fined, flogged, or exiled, but burial was for wives because wives carried the burden of lineage. If a woman's fidelity was in doubt, so was the legitimacy of children, and in medieval logic, that threatened entire systems of inheritance and power. Historians still debate whether these punishments reflected genuine religious fervor or sheer patriarchal control. Was the idea of burial alive meant to cleanse a community of sin, or simply to terrify women into obedience? Either way, it worked. The mere whisper that such a fate could await adulterers was enough to keep many walking the narrowest of lines. Imagine yourself standing at the edge of that pit, the crowd hushed, the shovel clanging against stone. You feel the cold seep upward from the soil, the last rays of sun slipping out of view. And then you realize this isn't just a punishment, it's a performance, a grim theatre in which your life is the closing act. So while most adulterers faced whips, stocks, or shaved heads, the rare sentence of burial alive stands out as one of the darkest symbols of medieval justice. It wasn't about survival, it wasn't even about repentance. It was about obliteration, making sure the body that had sinned was swallowed whole by the earth, never to trouble the living again. You might not expect this, but sometimes medieval punishments for adultery took on a strangely theatrical flair, involving not just whips or prisons, but animals. In certain places, adulterers were tied to beasts, donkeys, pigs, even dogs, and paraded through town as objects of ridicule. It wasn't about physical pain so much as turning human beings into a public joke, stripping away their dignity by making them part of a grotesque carnival. Picture it, the square buzzing with anticipation, children climbing onto barrels for a better view, adults laughing into their mugs of ale. Then the procession begins. A woman accused of adultery is dragged forward, struggling, her hair already shorn. But instead of being placed in stocks, she's tied to the back of a donkey. The animal brays, its hooves clattering on cobblestones as she's forced to ride backward, facing the crowd rather than the road ahead. People cheer, jeer, and hurl insults. To ride backward on a donkey was a medieval shorthand for disgrace, and everyone watching knew exactly what it meant. A mainstream fact, records from parts of medieval France and Germany describe adulterous women paraded on donkeys through town squares, sometimes stripped to a chemise, sometimes beaten as they went. In some cases, men caught in adultery were forced to lead the animal, humiliating both lovers together. Historians still argue whether these events were more punishment or carnival. Was justice truly being done, or was it just another excuse for public entertainment? And here's the quirky tidbit. In some towns, pigs were the preferred animal. Why pigs? Because they symbolized filth and gluttony, making the adulterer's sin look animalistic. Imagine being dragged by a snorting pig on a rope, stumbling in muck, villagers laughing at the symbolism of lust made flesh. Even dogs were sometimes used, with adulterers tethered to them and made to crawl on all fours. You were no longer human. You were branded beast. The sensory humiliation was overwhelming. You feel the coarse rope biting into your wrists, the sway of the donkey beneath you, the sharp stink of manure. Crowd presses close, faces flushed with laughter, hands reaching to throw vegetables or splash mud. Every step is a reminder that your dignity has been traded for ridicule. Men didn't always escape this fate. Husbands, caught in affairs, sometimes faced their own animal parades, forced to ride naked or half-naked, carrying horns on their heads as symbols of the cuckold. But again, women bore the harsher share. A man might walk away with jeers. A woman walked away with her reputation destroyed forever. Scholars still debate whether these parades were meant to be cleansing rituals or simply grotesque spectacles. Were they truly about purging sin from the community, or were they village festivals masquerading as moral discipline? The lines blur when justice comes with laughter and applause. Imagine yourself tied to that donkey, the world spinning backward as you're jolted along cobblestones, your ears full of brays and jeers, your cheeks burning hotter than the sun. The punishment leaves no scar on your skin, but it etches one deep into your soul. For weeks, months, maybe years afterward, you'll hear the mocking tone in neighbors' voices. Remember the donkey? So while whips and chains broke the body, these animal punishments broke something harder to heal, the sense of being human. And in the end, that might have been exactly what medieval justice wanted, to turn adulterers into walking, crawling symbols of disgrace, laughed at until the laughter itself became a warning for everyone else. You might not expect this, but sometimes punishment for adultery was worn right on the body, literally stitched into daily life. Beyond shaved heads and branded skin, medieval towns devised humiliating costumes designed to advertise shame. These weren't just rags, they were deliberate, theatrical outfits that turned adulterers into walking billboards of disgrace. Imagine being summoned before the town council. The verdict is read, guilty of adultery. Instead of lashes or chains, you're handed clothing so absurd and humiliating you almost wish for the whip instead. Perhaps it's a tunic sewn from mismatched colours, so loud you can't hide in a crowd. Maybe it's covered with symbols, horns for cuckoldry, bells to announce your steps, even painted patches marking sin. You're ordered to wear it in public for weeks, months, or in some cases, the rest of your life. A mainstream fact in parts of medieval Italy and the Low Countries, documented cases show adulterers forced to wear shame garments, sometimes white robes marked with crosses, sometimes gaudy cloaks that stood out in the market. These punishments overlapped with heresy trials, where clothing also symbolized disgrace. Historians still argue whether such costumes were used more often for adultery or for other moral crimes, but the practice appears across multiple town records. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some German towns required adulterers to wear giant wooden collars shaped like horns, strapped around the neck so everyone instantly saw their cuckoldry. Imagine trying to buy bread with a wooden halo of horns knocking over baskets as you turned. Every clumsy bump reminded the town who you were. The sensory experience was relentless. The fabric itched, the collar weighed on your shoulders, the bells jingled with every step. Children followed you, laughing. Neighbours stared, nudged one another, whispered behind hands. Even the silence carried weight. Conversations cut short as you walked by, heads turned away, doors quietly shut. The clothing wasn't just cloth, it was exile stitched into seams. And unlike a whipping or a day in the pillory, shame garments didn't end quickly. You had to live in them, sleep knowing tomorrow would bring the same humiliation. Worse, the longer the punishment lasted, the more it blended into your identity. People forgot your name and remembered only the outfit, the one in the horns. Men and women both faced this costume justice, though again, women often carried heavier burdens. A man might be mocked, laughed at, then forgiven. A woman could wear her shame for years, her marriage prospects and survival chances shredded along with her dignity. Historians still debate whether these garments were meant to purify or just to mock. But in practice, they worked like scarlet letters sewn across the body. No matter how faithfully you lived afterward, the costume ensured your sin walked with you, visible at every turn. Imagine yourself now, stumbling through the square in garish colours, bells jingling, horns knocking against doorframes. The punishment doesn't hurt your flesh, but it hurts something deeper. Your ability to disappear, to blend in, to feel human. In a world where community was survival, the cruelest sentence was becoming unforgettable for all the wrong reasons. You might not expect this, but sometimes adultery wasn't punished by separating lovers, it was punished by chaining them together. In certain medieval towns, when two people were caught in an affair, the sentence wasn't exile or death. Instead, they were bound side by side, sometimes by the neck, sometimes by the wrists, and forced to walk through the streets together as unwilling partners in disgrace. Picture it, the crowd already restless, gossip flowing like ale. Then the guards lead out not one prisoner but two. A man and a woman, roped together so tightly they stumble if they don't move in sync. Maybe their heads are yoked in a wooden collar, a double pillory that makes them shuffle awkwardly. Maybe their hands are tied so close their shoulders ache. Either way, the crowd roars with laughter because here are the guilty lovers exposed in public, united not by romance but by punishment. A mainstream fact in parts of medieval France and Germany, records describe adulterous couples paraded together in bonds, sometimes flogged as they walked. In certain Italian city-states, civic statutes prescribed that both guilty parties be tied together and displayed in marketplaces. Historians still argue whether the goal was to enforce equality of guilt or simply to humiliate them as a grotesque parody of marriage. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some towns forced adulterers to march backward while tied, making their shame both physical and symbolic. Walking backward was seen as unnatural, the opposite of proper order, just like their sin. Imagine trying to shuffle backward through muddy cobblestones while lashed to your guilty partner, bumping elbows, slipping, both of you covered in muck. The sensory humiliation was relentless. The rope rubbed your wrists raw. Every stumble yanked at your balance. The smell of sweat, dirt, and fear mingled with the laughter of children chasing behind. Someone threw an onion. Someone else shouted, "Kiss her now." You kept your head down, but it didn't matter. Every eye was on you. And the cruelty didn't end with the parade. Afterward, some couples were ordered to remain married, even if their affair had begun outside wedlock. Imagine being forced into permanent union with the very person who had brought your disgrace, condemned to spend your life tied not by love but by punishment. A marriage bed turned into a cell. Men sometimes tried to wriggle free of this fate, claiming they had been seduced or bewitched. Women rarely had such escape routes. More often, both were punished equally in theory, but in practice, the woman carried the longer-lasting shame, while the man might quietly rebuild his standing over time. Historians still debate whether these public bindings were intended as deterrents or simply as entertainment. The fact that crowds gathered eagerly suggests both. After all, what's more theatrical than two guilty lovers literally chained together? Now imagine yourself yoked to another body, your steps clumsy, your shoulders aching, the rope biting with every movement. You feel their breath hot on your cheek, hear the jeers echoing around you. You don't know whether you resent them more or the crowd that feeds on your disgrace. Either way, the lesson is clear. Your private passion has become a public cage. So while whips, brands, and dungeons punished the body, these forced remarriages and bindings punished the soul, trapping you in a partnership you never chose under the watchful gaze of a society that would never let you forget. You might not expect this, but when it came to adultery, the medieval justice system didn't treat everyone the same. If you were a peasant woman sneaking off with a neighbor, you risked shaved hair, whips, or worse. But if you were a noble, or better yet, royalty, your punishment might be little more than a stern lecture, a private confession, or at worst, a polite exile to an estate with good wine and decent tapestries. In other words, class decided your fate as much as sin did. Imagine standing in the market square, your scalp raw from shears, villagers laughing at your humiliation. Now picture the countess in her stone castle, accused of the same crime. Instead of stocks, she kneels in a private chapel, whispers her confession to a bishop, perhaps promises a donation to the church, and walks away with her dignity mostly intact. Same offence, two different worlds. A mainstream fact in 14th century France, noblemen and women often avoided corporal punishments for adultery, substituting fines, property adjustments, or arranged marriages. Chronicles note that scandals in royal courts were usually resolved quietly, sometimes by shipping the guilty woman off to a convent, sometimes by marrying her off to a politically useful husband. Historians still argue whether this leniency was about maintaining noble dignity or simply protecting powerful families from public shame. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some noblemen accused of affairs with queens or duchesses were punished not by death but by promotion, granted lands or offices far from court, as if the affair had been a career move gone sideways. Imagine committing adultery and being rewarded with your own castle in the countryside. It's less punishment, more relocation package. For royalty, the stakes were different. A queen accused of adultery technically risked her life because illegitimate heirs threatened dynasties, but in practice, even that often depended on politics. If her husband needed her family's alliance, accusations might be hushed up. If he didn't, then the full weight of the law and sometimes the executioner's sword fell. But peasants rarely had that margin for error. The sensory contrast is stark. A peasant adulterer smells of mud, sweat, and onions, standing in the stocks while neighbors jeer. A noble adulterer kneels on velvet cushions, incense filling the air, confessing in whispers no one else will hear. Both technically guilty, but only one forced to carry shame in public. Scholars still debate whether the disparity was hypocrisy or pragmatism. Did medieval societies truly believe nobles were morally superior, Or did they simply fear destabilizing the ruling class with too much scandal? Either way, the effect was the same. Punishment wasn't blind, it was selective. Imagine yourself at the edge of a crowd watching two different trials unfold. One poor woman paraded on a donkey, another noblewoman quietly sent to a convent for reflection. You feel the injustice burn. One punishment is spectacle, the other a whisper. Both are supposed to protect society, but one destroys a life while the other politely reshuffles it. So while peasants feared the whip, nobles feared little more than gossip. And in the end, that gap between punishments says more about medieval justice than the laws themselves. Adultery might have been the same sin, but the higher your birth, the softer the fall. You might not expect this, but while Europe had its whips, pillories, and shaved heads, other parts of the medieval world approached adultery with their own brand of severity. Punishments varied widely across cultures, but the theme was consistent. Adultery wasn't just a private slip. It was a threat to social order, and society responded with brutal creativity. Picture yourself leaving the familiar muddy square of a French village and stepping into the marble courtyards of Byzantium. Here, adultery was seen as both sin and crime, but the Byzantine approach leaned heavily on spectacle. Women caught in affairs might be paraded through the city streets wearing ridiculous costumes, sometimes with their hair cut short, sometimes branded. Men, on the other hand, were more likely fined or exiled. The punishment wasn't uniform. It depended on status, gender, and how loudly the scandal echoed through Constantinople's walls. A mainstream fact, Byzantine legal codes, like the Ecloga of the 8th century, listed flogging, exile, or shaving of the head as punishments for adultery. In some cases, women were confined to convents as a form of both imprisonment and supposed redemption. Historians still argue whether Byzantine punishments leaned more toward genuine penitence or toward making political examples of the guilty. Now shift your view further south and east into the Islamic world of the Middle Ages. Under certain interpretations of Sharia law, adultery, zina, was treated as one of the gravest sins, with punishments ranging from lashes to stoning. In practice, though, proving adultery required 4 witnesses, a nearly impossible standard, meaning that accusations often fell apart. Still, the threat loomed, and the weight of dishonor could be devastating even without formal punishment. Here's a quirky tidbit. In some Islamic regions, adulterers weren't just whipped, they were whipped in carefully counted strokes, often 100, with witnesses ensuring the number was exact. The symbolism mattered. The punishment wasn't random cruelty, but law carried out with precise ritual. Imagine standing in a courtyard as the whip cracks exactly 100 times, the crowd counting along in grim unison. Even in Jewish communities of medieval Europe, punishments could be harsh. Rabbinical courts often ordered flogging or divorce, stripping women of dowries or casting them out of the household. Again, the logic circled back to property, inheritance, and communal stability. Fidelity wasn't only a private vow, it was the glue holding together family lines. The sensory contrast is striking. In a German town, you might be shaved and whipped in the square. In Byzantium, you're marched through marble streets in ridiculous garb. In the Islamic world, you're struck 100 times under the desert sun. Every stroke counted aloud. In Jewish courts, you're stripped of home and dignity with a legal decree. Different languages, different laws, same theme. Society policed adultery with ferocity. Historians still debate whether these differences reveal cultural values or just variations on the same patriarchal script. Was Byzantium more theatrical, Islam more ritualistic, Western Europe more chaotic? Or were all of them simply different shades of the same obsession, controlling desire, protecting property, and keeping order? Imagine yourself wandering from one medieval culture to another, watching punishments unfold in squares, courts, and courtyards. The costumes change, the words differ, but the feeling is the same. Fear, shame, humiliation. No matter where you stood in the medieval world, adultery was never just between two people. It was a crime staged before the eyes of the whole community. And as you take that in, you realize Fidelity wasn't merely about love, it was about survival, reputation, and law, threads woven tightly across continents, binding humanity in ways both familiar and terrifying. You might not expect this, but adultery in the Middle Ages often got tangled up with something far more mysterious: magic. Whenever a case of infidelity arose, there was always a chance someone would whisper, "It wasn't her fault, she was bewitched," or "he drank a potion." Love potions, charms, and so-called aphrodisiacs weren't just playful legends, they were taken seriously, sometimes seriously enough to drag accused adulterers into witchcraft trials. Imagine the scene: a dim courtroom, the air thick with incense and suspicion. A woman stands accused not only of straying from her husband, but of using herbs and charms to lure her lover. Her punishment might have been one thing for adultery alone, but now it's multiplied by fear of sorcery. What was once a private sin has become a cosmic crime, threatening not just one marriage but the order of heaven and earth. A mainstream fact: records from 14th and 15th century France and Germany show cases where women accused of adultery were also charged with maleficium, the use of magic. Herbs like mandrake, henbane, or even simple wine spiced with honey could be labelled as love potions. Historians still argue whether these accusations reflected genuine belief in sorcery, or whether they were convenient excuses for men looking to explain affairs without blaming themselves. And here's the quirky tidbit. Some court cases mention men claiming they had been bewitched into affairs, as if their desire had nothing to do with them at all. Imagine standing in court, your lover pointing at you with wide eyes. "She enchanted me." It was the medieval version of "the devil made me do it," except now it came with the possibility of a witchcraft charge. The sensory picture is vivid. A woman grinding herbs in a mortar by candlelight, the bitter scent filling the room. A cup of spiced wine offered shyly to a man. Neighbours whispering about strange smells drifting from her cottage, or about candles burning too late at night. Suddenly, what might have been a simple affair is painted as a conspiracy of magic and lust. Punishments reflected this dual fear. Adultery might earn you the stocks, flogging, or exile. Add witchcraft to the mix and you risked fire. Burning at the stake wasn't the standard penalty for infidelity, but once sorcery was tied in, flames became frighteningly possible. Even if you escaped execution, your punishment doubled: banishment from your community, confiscation of property, or permanent branding as both adulteress and witch. Men were not immune, but women bore the brunt, since women were more often linked with knowledge of herbs and charms. And the gender imbalance sharpened further. A man's adultery might be dismissed as weakness, but a woman's could be painted as manipulation, enchantment, even conspiracy with the devil himself. Historians still debate whether love potions truly circulated widely, or whether they were mostly imagined. Did women really slip herbs into wine to spark desire? Or was it all a story told by frightened husbands and jealous neighbours? The truth is hazy, lost between real folk remedies and layers of fear. Imagine yourself accused. You're not only branded unfaithful, but neighbours claim they saw you stirring herbs at night, muttering prayers over a cup. You try to protest, it was just rosemary for stew, but the court only hears the word sorcery. Your fate, once a flogging or shaved head, now teeters on the edge of flames. So while many adulterers faced shame in the square, some faced something far darker: the accusation that they hadn't sinned alone, but with magic at their side. And in a world that saw witches in every shadow, that accusation could burn hotter than any desire ever did. You might not expect this, but when medieval courts handed down punishments for adultery, they rarely weighed men and women on the same scale. The imbalance was sharp, and it was everywhere. A husband's dalliance might be excused as weakness, shrugged off with a fine, or settled with a wink. A wife's dalliance, on the other hand, could bring ruin, not only upon herself, but upon her dowry, her children, and her family's honour. In the eyes of law and church, women carried the heavier burden. as though the weight of fidelity rested entirely on their shoulders. Picture it, 2 cases on the same day. A man accused of sleeping with his neighbour's wife stands before the magistrate. He pays a fine, bows low, and walks out, his reputation bruised but intact. The woman he lay with, she's paraded through town, her hair hacked short, jeers chasing her down the street. Contrast is stark, almost absurd. Same sin, 2 punishments, a mainstream fact under canon law, especially from the 12th century onward. Adultery by women was treated as a direct attack on marriage itself because it cast doubt on paternity. A man's infidelity, by contrast, was seen as less disruptive unless it involved another man's wife or a noble household. Historians still argue whether this double standard was rooted more in theology or in the obsession with inheritance and property. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some places, cuckolded husbands were even mocked as victims, while wives of unfaithful men had little recourse at all. In England, ballads circulated poking fun at horned husbands, as if their humiliation was comedy. Imagine it, a man's shame turned into a folk song, while a woman's shame turned into mutilation. The sensory reality for women was harsh. Imagine kneeling barefoot at a church door, head shaved, candle trembling in your hands, the crowd whispering. Your lover, if male, might be absent entirely, punished with nothing more than a payment of silver, already back at home drinking ale. You feel not only your own disgrace, but the injustice burning hotter than the candle flame. Even language itself carried the imbalance. Words like whore, adulteress, fallen woman stuck like tar, while men were rarely branded with lasting labels. If anything, men gained nicknames in jest. Women gained reputations that followed them to the grave. Historians still debate whether medieval people saw this as fairness or hypocrisy. Some argue it was simply practical. Since a woman's infidelity threatened lineage, it was treated more seriously. Others insist it was plain misogyny disguised as theology. Either way, the law was not blind, it was one-eyed, and that eye focused squarely on women. Imagine yourself in that world, watching neighbours punished unevenly. A man struts home with nothing but lighter pockets. A woman limps home, scalp bare, dignity shredded. Tomorrow the man might joke about his sin at the tavern. The woman, meanwhile, can't buy bread without stares burning her skin. So while the Middle Ages had plenty of brutal punishments for adultery, what made them truly cruel was the silence around men's guilt and the noise around women's. Women bore the lash, the shave, the brand, the exile, while men often walked away chuckling. And that imbalance wasn't just law, it was culture, reinforced in every jeer, every whisper, every hymn sung over a kneeling, humiliated wife. You might not expect this, but even the very men who thundered from pulpits about the evils of adultery weren't always as pure as their sermons suggested. Priests, bishops, even abbots, many of them carried on secret affairs, kept mistresses, or fathered children, despite the vows of celibacy they had taken. And when their hypocrisy was exposed, the punishments they faced were often far lighter than those they imposed on ordinary people. Picture yourself sitting in a crowded church, listening to a priest rail against the carnal sin of adultery. His voice booms, his finger jabs the air, his words drip with righteous fire. Now imagine the whispers afterward. That same priest has been seen slipping out of the rectory at night, visiting a widow's house, or secretly supporting a child who looks suspiciously like him. The dissonance is almost laughable if it weren't so devastating to those punished under his authority. A mainstream fact, despite clerical celibacy being formally enforced from the 12th century onward, historians estimate that a significant number of medieval priests kept concubines or mistresses. In some dioceses, fines were routinely collected from clergy known to be in illicit relationships, essentially turning sin into a revenue stream. It became so common that councils repeatedly issued decrees condemning the practice. Historians still argue whether these decrees reflect new outbreaks of sin or simply the persistence of an old habit. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some towns, everyone knew which priest had a mistress, and the relationship was treated like an open secret. Parishioners even nicknamed children thought to be fathered by priests, calling them sons of the church. Imagine growing up with that label, knowing everyone in your village saw your very existence as proof of hypocrisy. When priests were caught formally, their punishments were usually private. A bishop might order penance, fines, or reassignment to a different parish. Rarely were they flogged or paraded as lay adulterers were. The church guarded its reputation, preferring to hush up scandals rather than parade its own shame. A peasant might be shaved and whipped in the market square. A priest might be quietly transferred to a village 2 valleys away. The sensory irony is striking. A woman kneels barefoot at the church door, candle trembling, her humiliation public. Meanwhile, the priest who shared her sin whispers prayers in private, kneels on velvet cushions, and perhaps promises a donation to the poor as atonement. One body suffers in the cold, the other is wrapped in incense and ceremony. Historians still debate whether this hypocrisy weakened faith or simply reinforced the church's power. Did villagers secretly resent their priests, or did they accept the double standard as inevitable? Some records suggest both. Anger simmered, but few dared to challenge openly. After all, to accuse a priest was to risk excommunication, or worse. Imagine yourself watching this imbalance unfold. You see neighbours whipped, branded, exiled for adultery, while the priest who shared their bed walks away with little more than a muttered prayer and a change of parish. The injustice gnaws at you, but the system is immovable. The pulpit still thunders, the punishments still fall, just never equally. So while medieval law books wrote endlessly about punishing adultery, the practice often depended on who you were. And when the guardians of morality broke their own vows, they usually landed softly, cushioned by the very authority that should have judged them most harshly. You might not expect this, but adultery in the Middle Ages didn't always come to light through obvious evidence. More often than not, it came from whispers, suspicious glances, or the relentless curiosity of neighbours and relatives. Communities acted as spies, watching one another's movements with hawk-like eyes, ready to pounce at the faintest whiff of scandal. In a world where privacy was scarce, your reputation depended not just on what you did, but on what people thought you did. Picture it. A small village tucked between fields, smoke curling from thatched chimneys. Every door is open to the street, every window a listening post. If you visit another household too often, if you're seen lingering in the wrong alleyway, if someone spots a candle burning too late in your chamber, tongues begin to wag. By morning, your name is already circulating with raised eyebrows and knowing smirks. A mainstream fact? Many adultery cases recorded in medieval courts began not with confessions but with denunciations from neighbours. Legal systems like the canon courts often relied heavily on witness testimony. Suspicion, rumour, and circumstantial detail, like who was seen entering whose house at what hour, could be enough to ruin lives. Historians still argue whether these courts genuinely sought truth or whether they simply institutionalized gossip as evidence. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some German towns, neighbours were actually rewarded for reporting adultery. If their accusations led to conviction, they might receive part of the adulterer's fine or confiscated property. Imagine the motivation that created. Suddenly, peeking through shutters wasn't just nosiness, it was an investment opportunity. The sensory atmosphere of surveillance is easy to imagine. A knock at your door, and you open it to find the bailiff standing grimly, flanked by 2 neighbours with arms crossed. They nod solemnly as he declares you accused. You glance at those familiar faces, the ones who shared bread with you, who borrowed your tools, and realise they've been watching, judging, waiting. The air in the room feels heavy, as if betrayal itself is pressing down on your chest. The fear of denunciation kept communities tightly bound. Couples avoided even innocent gestures that might be misread. A woman lingering at a well, laughing too warmly with a man not her husband, risked weeks of suspicion. A man seen walking home with a widow might wake to whispers that he had spent the night in her bed. In villages where everyone knew everyone, secrets were as rare as locked doors. Historians still debate whether this culture of spying was driven more by moral zeal or by petty rivalries. After all, accusing your neighbour of adultery could damage their standing, free up land, or settle old grudges. Morality and self-interest blurred until it was hard to tell one from the other. Imagine yourself lying awake at night, hearing footsteps outside, knowing it could be a neighbour slipping past or a neighbour watching you. Every creak of your floorboards feels like a betrayal, every candle flame like a signal. You can almost feel the weight of unseen eyes through cracks in shutters, and so while courts and priests wrote the laws, it was the community that enforced them. Gossip was the first punishment, formal judgment the second. Adultery wasn't just a private sin, it was a public drama, performed under the gaze of a village eager for scandal. And in that theatre, your neighbours were both audience and actors, ready to turn your whispers into their testimonies. You might not expect this, but in the rarefied world of royalty, adultery wasn't just a moral failing, it was treason. When a queen strayed, the consequences weren't whispers at the well or shaved hair in the square. They were crowns toppled, dynasties threatened, and heads quite literally on the block. Because a queen's body wasn't just her own, it was the vessel for heirs, the safeguard of kingdoms, the glue binding alliances. If that sacred role was questioned, the whole realm trembled. Picture it, a glittering medieval court, banners hanging high, nobles whispering in shadowed alcoves. Rumours swirl that the queen has been too friendly with a courtier. The king's gaze grows colder, ambassadors murmur in concern, and suddenly the accusation isn't just about broken vows, it's about succession. If the queen has lain with another man, is the heir still legitimate? Or has the bloodline been tainted? That question alone could start wars. A mainstream fact, in 16th century England, Anne Boleyn, second wife of Henry VIII, was accused of adultery along with treason and witchcraft, and executed in 1536. Whether guilty or not, the charge itself was enough to justify her downfall. Historians still argue whether the accusations were fabricated for political convenience or rooted in genuine suspicion. The lesson is clear. When queens were accused, the punishment was often fatal. Here's the quirky tidbit. In medieval France, chroniclers wrote about Queen Marguerite of Burgundy, accused of adultery in the 14th century. She was imprisoned in Château Gaillard, where she later died under mysterious circumstances. Some say strangled, others that she starved. Her supposed lovers weren't merely whipped or fined, they were executed, flayed, or mutilated in horrific public displays. When royal honour was at stake, punishments became extravagantly brutal. The sensory weight of it all is staggering. Imagine standing in a grand hall, sunlight spilling through stained glass, as lords and bishops pronounce judgment on you, not as a woman but as a political danger. The whispers of courtiers cut sharper than knives, the silence of allies more damning than open accusations. You feel the air thicken with treason, your own breath shallow, the crown on your head suddenly heavier than iron chains. For men, the story was different. Kings and princes kept mistresses openly, sometimes flaunting them at court without fear of punishment. Their infidelity was treated as a footnote, even a sign of virility. Queens, however, walked a razor's edge. A single rumour could condemn them to imprisonment, exile, or death. Historians still debate whether these cases reveal a genuine obsession with morality or simply the ruthless politics of power. Was Anne Boleyn punished for adultery or for failing to give Henry a male heir? Was Marguerite condemned for her sins or sacrificed to protect her family's honour? The truth lies blurred in the shadow where politics and passion meet. Imagine yourself as a queen accused. Guards surround you, the courtiers you once trusted look away, and the crown that once gleamed as security now gleams as a target. The punishment won't be shaved hair or a wooden bridle. It will be history itself writing your downfall, carving your name into tales of scandal, treason, and execution. So while peasants dreaded the stocks or the lash, queens dreaded the sword. For them, adultery wasn't merely a sin, it was a death sentence, a crime that could topple thrones and redraw the map of Europe. You might not expect this, but the punishments for adultery didn't just appear in law codes or courtrooms. They seeped into songs, stories, and the folklore that ordinary people told each other at night. In many ways, the cultural imagination punished adulterers just as harshly as the judges did. Tales of betrayal and brutal justice echoed through villages, turning private sins into cautionary ballads, sung by firesides or chanted in taverns. Imagine a group of peasants gathered in a smoky alehouse. The fire crackles, mugs of ale clink, and in the corner a fiddler plucks out a tune. Then someone begins a ballad, a song about a woman who strayed from her husband and was flogged through the streets, or a knight who dallied with a queen and ended up on the gallows. The crowd leans in, half horrified, half delighted, murmuring the refrain they've all heard since childhood. The melody is catchy, the story gruesome, and as the night wears on, everyone stumbles home with the tale still ringing in their heads. Adultery brings ruin. A mainstream fact, medieval ballads and fabliaux, comic tales, often portrayed adulterers meeting grisly ends, burned, hanged, or mutilated. These stories weren't just entertainment, they reinforced social codes. Historians still argue whether such tales reflected real punishments or exaggerated them for dramatic effect, but their purpose was clear: to warn. Here's the quirky tidbit: some towns had rhyming couplets mocking local scandals. Imagine walking through the market and hearing children chant a rhyme about your shaved head or your donkey ride punishment. The shame wasn't confined to one day. It became immortalized in song, carried on the lips of every giggling child. The sensory world of these stories was vivid. You can almost hear the lilt of a minstrel's voice, see villagers leaning forward as the tale builds to its grisly climax. The punishments described, fiery ordeals, drowning pits, parades with animals, were embroidered with theatrical detail. Maybe the real punishments weren't always so extreme, but in story form they became larger than life, cementing fear and fascination. And of course, the double standards persisted here too. Male adulterers might appear in fabliaux as roguish tricksters, their punishment comic rather than tragic. Female adulterers, by contrast, often suffered grisly ends in both song and tale, beaten, disfigured, or killed, their suffering treated as moral instruction. Historians still debate whether these stories were satire, exaggeration, or earnest warnings. Some argue they let people laugh at authority, mocking priests and lords with tales of their own hypocrisy. Others believe the songs reinforced the very order they pretended to ridicule. Perhaps both were true. Imagine yourself listening late at night, drifting towards sleep, hearing a story about an unfaithful wife drowned in a river by her neighbors. The details blur between real memory and fable, but the message lingers: stray and ruin follows. These weren't just punishments, they were bedtime stories, morality plays for a society obsessed with order. So while judges wielded whips and priests shaved heads, storytellers wielded words. And sometimes those words cut deeper, echoing for generations, turning a single act of betrayal into a legend of warning sung for centuries after. You might not expect this, but beneath all the blood, bells, and public jeers, there was always a quieter question simmering. Were these punishments really about morality, or were they mostly about property and control? Historians still argue about it because the pattern is too obvious to ignore. Adultery was treated as a spiritual sin, yes, but the punishments so often revolved around protecting lineage, inheritance, and ownership. Picture it. A husband storms into court, red-faced, accusing his wife of betrayal. The judge listens gravely, but notice where his questions go. Not, "Do you repent?" Not even, "Who was the man?" Instead, were children born? Whose dowry was involved? Who stands to inherit the estate? Suddenly the trial isn't about love or lust, it's about land, titles, and coin. A woman's body is treated like a ledger, her fidelity the lock, protecting property lines. A mainstream fact, legal codes across Europe tied adultery directly to inheritance laws. Under canon law, a child born of adultery was considered illegitimate and could not inherit. That meant adultery threatened dynasties, farms, and entire family fortunes. Some historians go so far as to call adultery economic treason. since it destabilized property more than it disrupted hearts. Here's the quirky tidbit. In some towns, if a wife was accused but her husband chose to forgive her, the court still confiscated part of her dowry. Why? Because even forgiveness couldn't erase the risk to property. Imagine being dragged through humiliation only to watch your household stripped anyway, all because officials worried your children might not count. The sensory experience of this obsession comes alive in the details. Imagine court clerks scratching furiously with quills as witnesses describe not kisses or whispers, but the value of land, the number of sheep, the weight of coins. The air smells of parchment and wax. The voices drone with legalese, but underneath it all beats the same fear. Who owns what and whose bloodline gets it? For men, adultery was rarely framed this way, unless they were foolish enough to entangle themselves with another nobleman's wife. Then it became treason because property and power overlapped. For women, though, every affair, real or imagined, was treated as theft. Fidelity wasn't about affection. It was about protecting the husband's claim to his own heirs. Historians still debate whether morality was just the mask property wore. Did medieval courts thunder about sin to make punishment sound holy, while really they were just bookkeeping? Or did people genuinely believe desire endangered souls and estates equally? The records blur the line, but the outcomes speak clearly. The body was punished, but the property was protected. Imagine yourself in that courtroom, your dignity already gone. The judge looks at you not as a person but as a risk to inheritance. Your children are eyed with suspicion, your family's farm hangs in the balance, and your husband is urged to claim what's rightfully his. You stand there barefoot, humiliated, realizing the lash might sting for a day, but the property loss will echo for generations. So while the sermons warned of lust and the punishment screamed of shame, the deeper truth may have been simpler and colder. Adultery wasn't punished because love strayed. It was punished because property strayed. You might not expect this, but punishments for adultery didn't stay quite as brutal forever. By the late Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, attitudes began to soften, not because people suddenly became tolerant, but because the machinery of justice shifted. Where once there had been whips, pits, and iron cages, there were now fines, annulments, or quiet exile. The spectacle of public humiliation gave way, little by little, to quieter punishments behind closed doors. Picture yourself walking through a 15th-century Italian city, the streets bustling with merchants, scholars, and artists. Life here feels different from the muddy villages and torchlit courts of earlier centuries. Renaissance values are creeping in. Humanism, a focus on individual dignity, even a little more discretion. Adultery is still a sin, of course, but punishments now often involve money rather than mutilation. Instead of being whipped through the streets, you might be fined heavily, or your marriage annulled, leaving you socially ruined but physically intact. A mainstream fact. By the 15th and 16th centuries in many European cities, civic courts increasingly substituted monetary fines or civil penalties for corporal punishments. In Venice, for instance, adultery could result in exile from the city for a set number of years, while in Florence, repeat offenders risked losing property rather than limbs. Historians still argue whether this reflected genuine moral leniency or simply the rise of bureaucracies that preferred tidy financial settlements over messy public bloodshed. Here's the quirky tidbit. Some cities offered adulterers the option of wearing symbolic clothing instead of enduring mutilation. A husband and wife caught together in scandal might be marched through the streets in ridiculous outfits, but at least they got to keep their noses and ears. Imagine strutting through Florence in a bright yellow tunic painted with horns, the crowd laughing, but knowing that tomorrow you'll return home with your face and your life still intact. The sensory change is striking. Instead of shrieks echoing off stone walls, you hear the clink of coins on wooden tables, the shuffle of parchment as clerks record fines. Instead of bodies branded or buried, you see people quietly vanish from the city for a year or two, returning later to resume life, scandal lingering but not destroyed. Of course, the double standards lingered. Men still often walked away with lighter sentences. Women still faced harsher scrutiny, though the punishment stopped short of mutilation in many places. And for queens and noblewomen, adultery could still mean death when politics demanded it. The Renaissance softened justice for many, but not for all. Historians still debate whether this softening truly reflected progress, or whether it simply disguised control in new forms. After all, fines filled civic coffers, and exiles removed troublemakers without staining city squares with blood. Was it mercy or efficiency? Imagine yourself in this changing world. Instead of standing in a pit with stones raining down, you stand before a magistrate in crimson robes who calmly declares you fined 10 florins and exiled for a year. The humiliation burns, but the relief is undeniable. You'll live. You'll keep your face, your voice, your body intact. So while earlier centuries had punished adultery with fire, water, and iron, the Renaissance began to punish it with ink, coin, and exile. The brutality dimmed, but the shadow of shame remained, reminding everyone that even in a more civilized age, love outside marriage could still cost you everything. You might not expect this, but even though medieval punishments for adultery eventually faded, their echoes still linger today. The whips, stocks, and mutilations may be gone, but in many parts of the world, adultery remains a legal offense, and the shadow of those old codes still shapes how societies judge infidelity. The Middle Ages never truly left us, they just changed costumes. Imagine walking into a modern courtroom. The judge isn't in a fur-trimmed robe, the clerk isn't scratching quills, but the words sound familiar. Adultery, dishonor, custody, property. Instead of whips, there are divorce decrees. Instead of shaved heads, there are custody battles and ruined reputations. The punishments are no longer measured in lashes, but in legal fees, lost homes, and broken families. Different tools, same anxieties. A mainstream fact until the late 20th century, adultery was still a criminal offense in many European countries, and in the United States, some states still have adultery laws on the books today, even if rarely enforced. In parts of the Middle East, South Asia, and Africa, adultery can still carry severe punishments, including imprisonment or corporal punishment. Historians and legal scholars still argue whether this continuity reflects religious tradition, patriarchal control, or simply inertia from centuries-old codes. Here's the quirky tidbit. In a few American states, adultery is technically punishable by small fines or jail time, though cases are so rare that they usually make headlines just for the novelty. Imagine being hauled into court in the 21st century and hearing your lawyer say, "Yes, Your Honor, my client pleads guilty to adultery," while the entire courtroom stifles laughter at how medieval the law still sounds. The sensory echoes of the past are everywhere. The gossip of neighbors that once condemned you at the village well is now the whisper of co-workers around the office coffee pot. The public humiliation of the stocks has become the viral scandal on social media. Instead of being paraded on a donkey, you're paraded in headlines, your name tagged and retweeted thousands of times. And just like in the Middle Ages, the punishments are uneven. Men are often excused or even admired for affairs, while women still face harsher scrutiny and lasting reputational scars. The centuries-old double standard hasn't disappeared, it's just slipped into subtler forms. Historians still debate whether our modern shame culture is more merciful or simply more invisible. Are divorce papers gentler than whips? Or do the emotional scars of betrayal and public exposure cut just as deep? Imagine yourself centuries after the medieval world, scrolling on your phone and seeing someone's private life explode into headlines. You wince, you shake your head, maybe you even laugh, and then you realize this is the stocks reborn, the pillory in pixels, the same old punishment dressed up in new technology. So while the torches and chains have been replaced by hashtags and tabloids, the message is eerily familiar. Adultery still carries punishment, still sparks outrage, still leaves scars. The medieval world whispers to us through courtrooms and gossip alike, reminding us that what was once judged in the square is now judged on screens. You might not expect this, but as we finally leave behind the long march of medieval punishments, what lingers most is not the lash, the brand, or the pit of earth. It's the memory of shame. Adultery in the Middle Ages wasn't just treated as a sin against God, it was treated as a crime against society itself. And though the centuries have shifted, the echoes remain, weaving their way into how we still talk about fidelity, morality, and betrayal today. Picture it one last time. The village square buzzing with curiosity, the pillory creaking as its hinges clamp shut, the jeers of neighbours rising into the air. Or perhaps a solemn church, the smell of incense thick, as a barefoot sinner kneels clutching a candle too tall to carry. Or the chilling silence of a pit, soil falling heavy on a bound body. Each punishment, brutal in its own way, was designed to do more than discipline. It was meant to etch fear into the hearts of everyone watching. A mainstream fact, by the close of the Middle Ages, legal codes across Europe still listed adultery as a punishable offence, but the harshest penalties, stoning, mutilation, burial alive, had grown rarer. Public shame, exile, and fines took their place. Historians still argue whether this shift marked progress, or simply a subtler way to control desire and inheritance. And here's one last quirky tidbit. Some towns kept their pillories standing even after they stopped using them. They became symbols, silent wooden warnings that reminded passers-by what could happen if they strayed. Imagine a child tugging at her mother's sleeve asking, "Baston, what's that?" and hearing, "That's where the sinners used to stand." A relic, but still a threat. The story of medieval adultery punishments isn't only about cruelty, it's about how societies police intimacy, how power decides who suffers and who escapes, and how fear becomes a tool sharper than any whip. And as you trace that history, you see the threads leading forward, from village squares to tabloids, from stocks to social media, from whispered denunciations to viral scandals. The tools change, the shame remains. Now, as the journey winds down, you let the noise of those medieval punishments fade. The jeering crowds, the ringing bells, the scrape of iron, the shuffle of bare feet through mud, all grow distant, softer, like echoes carried away on the wind. What remains is a hush, a reminder that even in the darkest chapters people survived, endured, and sometimes even laughed at the absurdity of it all. So breathe deeply. Let the medieval square dissolve. Let the candle gutters go dark. Let the cold river water still. You are no longer there, no longer bound in ropes or stocks. You are here, safe, listening in the quiet of your own space. The story has ended, but the lessons linger gently. That shame can wound deeper than steel. That justice is rarely blind, and that history is filled with both cruelty and resilience. Now dim the lights a little further. Let your breath slow and let your body ease into stillness. Imagine the faintest rustle of straw beneath you, the warmth of a hearth in the distance, the soft hum of a lullaby drifting across centuries. And with that, let the last images dissolve into calm. Let the centuries fall silent. Rest easy, knowing the story is complete, and that nothing waits for you now but peace. As the last echoes of medieval punishments fade, the pace softens, like a candle flickering low at the end of a long night. You feel yourself stepping away from the noise of the crowd, the clang of chains, the harsh voice of judges, and moving instead into stillness. The air is cooler now, softer, and every breath feels like a thread unwinding. The images you've carried, the pillory, the whip, the cold river, the pit of earth, blur into shadow, distant and harmless, no longer able to touch you. They drift like smoke, curling upward and vanishing into the dark. What lingers is not fear, but calm, a reminder that even the harshest moments of history pass, and that all things, even shame and cruelty, dissolve in time. Your body sinks deeper, heavier into comfort. The bed beneath you feels steadier, the air around you warmer. The world narrows to quiet rhythms, the hum of a fan, the gentle beat of your own heart, the slow tide of breath rising and falling. Each exhale carries you further from the noise of punishment, further into the hush of safety. The story has ended, and with it the weight of centuries slips from your shoulders. What remains is peace, a stillness older than the Middle Ages, deeper than any punishment, softer than any whisper of shame. So let yourself drift, let yourself rest. Imagine a calm meadow at dawn or a quiet cloister where bells ring not for punishment but for prayer. You are safe there. You are whole. You are free. And as you close your eyes fully, let the final thought be simple. The past is behind you, the night is gentle, and sleep is waiting.